Everybody, welcome to the Spring into Action workshop series. Today we're going to be covering paper making, and then next week will be the last of this series, and that will be in maple tree identification and how to make maple syrup. So you can register on the library website, or you can join the meetings through the ID and password listed over here on the left-hand side. So for today, we'll talk about the process of making paper, the paper industry, and the different kinds of pollution associated with that, as well as how to make your own paper out of recycled materials. So the paper and pulp industry are actually really large contributors to overall pollution on the planet. So they're using a lot of energy as well as a lot of freshwater resources in order to create these paper products. The most current statistic that I could find is that the paper and pulp industry actually uses about 4% of the amount of energy produced by the world. So that's a really large amount. And what is troubling about the paper industry is actually a lot of the byproducts of the process are pollutants, and they end up in the environment through their wastewater and different kinds of sludges that they produce. And along with that, the raw materials come from usually from wood or from repurposed materials. And so the more trees we cut down, the more of an environmental impact that's going to have. So in the US, we use about 6 gallons of water to create 1 pound of paper, and the average person uses about 700 pounds of paper products per year. So that's packaging, tissues, paper towels, all types of things like that. And so there's a significant amount of water that we're allocating to the production of these paper products. And so the last one there, 1 sheet of A4 paper can require about 5 gallons of water to make. So that's an extreme. So a lot of different paper products are requiring large quantities of water to produce. And along with that, they're having high energy demands in the overall production process. So if we just do a quick calculation for people in the US, right, we use, if it takes about 6 gallons of water to create a pound of paper, and we use about 700 pounds of paper as an individual, then each person is responsible for 4,200 gallons of water going into that industry every year. And so as we know, fresh water is a limited resource on the planet. And so not only using it should we be mindful, but in the way that it is managed, and the pollutants and kinds of compounds that end up in that water and how it's released back into the environment. So there's a lot of different things that can happen once that wastewater is released into the environment. So one of those things is the wastewater is going to go into streams and rivers, and so that will contribute to aquatic ecosystem toxicity. So different kinds of organic and inorganic compounds are going to be in that wastewater. And what can happen is that they can last in the environment for a very long time. And on top of that, the organisms can actually uptake those pollutants if they're filter feeders or by feeding and so on. And so once those contaminants are inside of those organisms, they can have effects. And so that can be, maybe it causes defects and in formation and development. It can change gene expression, all types of different things. So these are things to be mindful. How much pollutants are we allowing to go into the environment, and what are those things doing? And unfortunately, we're a part of that system as well, right? As people, we're at the top of that food chain. And so we eat different kinds of animals, and those pollutants will magnify up the food web and enter into ourselves, and that will create a health hazard for us. Another thing is that wastewater will also be used for agricultural purposes. And so when those different kinds of pollutants go into the soil, they will end up getting uptaken by different kinds of plants through that process, and then again can be eaten by other animals or by us. And so we can see how just from a pulp and paper factory, the pollutants will carry its way through the environment and essentially make its way into different kinds of organisms, including ourselves. And another aspect of that is that these industries are going to have other waste products such as a sludge. And those sludges will have different kinds, again, of different kinds of pollutants in them. And that will, they can persist in the environment long term and can create other health hazards. So it's just one thing to consider is that this industry is a large industry. It's a resource intensive industry, and it does have an environmental consequence like most of the things we do. And so when it comes to how much paper products are being used, we can see on this figure that there's a large footprint coming from North America. So, and this is per capita. So basically what that means is that the people in North America consume more paper products than elsewhere in the world. So we can see kind of close up is Europe and Asia, and the smallest being in Africa. And so basically what this means is that we're responsible for a lot of the production and a lot of the consumption, and therefore we're responsible for a lot of the carbon footprint and the pollution generated from this industry. So the top three consumers of paper products are China, the USA, and Japan, and combined we make up 50% of all of the global paper consumption. And only 2% of that is coming from the entire continent of Africa. So we can see that it's pretty disproportionate. And right behind this grouping of countries is Europe. Europe comes behind this as well. And so there's kind of a push now for more efficient and sustainable practices in making paper products. And that can come in the form of reusing paper or different sources of paper. It can also come from cutting back on the raw materials, such as cutting down trees. And it also relates to the efficiency in the actual process of the paper making inside of the factory. So there's multiple different things that these factories could do to save on water, to prevent the leakage of different kinds of contaminants into the environment, and so on. And so when we look at the amount of paper products being used, if we look at this graphic, we can see that this kind of like teal line has the highest one, right? Tons of paper products. And that belongs to packaging material. And from my perspective, this makes a lot of sense, right? We ship a lot of things. And so we put a lot of packaging around different kinds of items. If you ever get like a package from you order online, sometimes it's double or triple packaged, right? So this is having a large impact in terms of our consumption. So every time we order something online or we have something shipped to our house or wherever, we're using a lot of packaging materials. And next behind that is printing and writing paper. And even then you can see it's a pretty drastic decrease in the amount of consumption in these kinds of products. So another way to kind of tackle the consumption aspect is to decrease the amount of packaging material we're using. So that might be more efficient design of the way we package things, smaller boxes or envelopes or things like that. It might also mean decreasing the amount of things that are being shipped. And then down here, more on the lower end, we have newsprint. Most of our news we get online now, and so there's not a large demand anymore to have printed newspapers. And then tissue paper, so such as paper towels, tissues and products along those lines. So we can see that the biggest impact is actually going to be on packaging materials. But overall, the paper industry is using a significant amount of energy and water. And so if we can kind of repurpose materials, we can save water along the way, and we can prevent different kinds of pollutants from entering the environment in that way. And so when we look at this graphic, we can see that 55% of the material being used in paper production is actually recovered fiber, which is really great, right? We see more than half of the material is being repurposed. But we also see at the same time that 42% of the starting material is from virgin fiber, meaning that it's coming from raw materials like cutting down trees and logging. And so the big takeaway here is that we want to create a pie chart that looks different from this, where we're shrinking this virgin fiber slice and increasing this recovered fiber slice. So the more we can recycle the fibers, actually the more trees we save, the more water we save, and the more energy we save. Because into every kind of resource, there's energy that goes into obtaining it. So for example, with trees, every time we go to cut down trees, there's a lot of resources that goes into that process. So that can be the fossil fuels that are needed to run the machinery. That can be the water used to process those new logs. Whereas if we already have those fibers, we've already recovered them, we've already eliminated this very intensive labor and energy and resource rich step, which is obtaining the raw material. So keeping these products in circulation, just reusing and repurposing the fibers, is going to decrease the demand for trees. And I'm sure we've all heard of deforestation. And so while this is needed to create the raw fibers, initially, we don't have to continuously do this. And there's different ways we can approach this. That's like different ways that we can forest the land, different management practices. But ultimately, there's a lot of consequences to cutting down forest habitat. So one of those is that you actually decrease the amount of habitat available to the local animals. But another aspect of that is you are decreasing the ecosystem services that that forest provides, not only to the animals that live there, but to us as people. So forests are really important in terms of our carbon cycling and our water cycling. So if we first want to think about water cycling, trees are really important for capturing water and stabilizing land, especially when we have large storms. The less trees we have, the less roots we have, and therefore that soil can become very unstable and can erode away and kind of go into our streams and rivers and cause lots of downstream effects on aquatic animals and their environments. Another aspect of this is that trees are responsible for photosynthesis. And during that process, they take atmospheric carbon dioxide and they convert it into sugars that are then used to produce their leaves, their bark, their roots, which is collectively called biomass. So when we cut down trees, we're decreasing the capacity of that forest to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it as biomass. And that's called carbon sequestration. So we're losing that ecosystem service with that. In addition, trees provide a lot of shade and temperature regulation. And so we can actually change local temperatures by cutting down large amounts of forest at the same time. And along with that, when we decrease the habitat, we can jeopardize the ability of different organisms to thrive in that environment. And therefore, that can put their ability to survive at risk and therefore can lead to a loss of biodiversity. And that term collectively just means how many different species are you seeing in an area? So if you have, for an example, a vulnerable population of plants or insects, and then you cut down that forest and it changes the landscape for them and their ability to grow, then you might get rid of an entire food source for an organism, and because they're already threatened or vulnerable, they might not be able to come back from something like that. So deforestation plays a really big part in having stable ecosystems that continuously keep on giving all of these services to us. And unfortunately, what happens, even if we cut down trees and replant them, they're not ever going to sequester as much carbon as an untouched forest. And so what that essentially means is even if you cut down a big tree and plant 5 other trees in its place, it's still not going to sequester and provide the same amount of ecosystem services as if you had just left that one tree there. So disturbing forests overall leads to a lot of consequences in the environment and the services we're able to get from that. So taking this all into consideration, and all of these paper products, one thing that you can do that is also fun is to create your own paper out of recycled material. So I'll go into the process for this. So this is actually a really fun thing that you can do, and it's really simple and easy as well. It doesn't require a lot of supplies. You'll just need some water. Scrap paper you can use. I'm going to shred my bills and make paper out of them. You can use different kinds of old paper towels. You can use any paper that you're not using that's just kind of lying around. It can be different colors. You just want to shy away from kind of like plastic-like materials and magazines and such. Those are not going to work as well in this kind of procedure. So on top of the scrap paper and the water, you'll also need a blender. It's recommended that once you use a blender for paper making that you don't use it again. I don't know how true that is if you wash it. And then you'll also need like a tub, like a plastic container will work fine, maybe one that you use in your laundry room or something. And then you'll also need like a flat surface. That can be a wooden board, that can be plexiglass. You can even just use your table. And then you're also definitely going to need a sponge. And if you want, you can also use like a rolling pin or even like one of those paint rollers. You can also use that in this procedure. And you'll also need an absorbent material. So I've seen a lot of people use towels or those really absorbent ShamWow cloths. You can also use wool blankets and different kinds of felt. So basically, you need stuff to create a paper slurry, and then you need to be able to dry it. And so the first step is to actually take your scrap paper and cut it into 1-inch squares. You can also, if you have a paper shredder, just put that paper through the paper shredder. And then you'll put it in some water and let it soak for a few hours or overnight. I have seen other procedures that don't even do that. So it's not completely necessary that you soak the paper at all. But in the one procedure I read, this was recommended. And again, don't put any magazines in there. You want to stick to fiber papers. You can separate your paper into different colors and so on, or you can kind of put it all together and kind of see how it comes out. The second step is to blend it all up. So once you have all of your paper, you can put it into the blender. You want to put a lot of water in there because you don't want to put too much stress on the blender. It'll burn out and it won't be able to create your slurry. So you put about a handful of that wet paper in there, and then you add even more water. You want your blender to almost be full of water after you put like a handful or so of that pre-soaked paper in there. And then you'll blend it up using the blender. So it's recommended that you use the pulse option for this. And you don't want to over blend it because kind of like the fibers in there, if you have kind of bigger pieces, it'll add to the texture and aesthetic of your paper. So I guess that's more of a personal preference kind of thing. The third step is to transfer your pulp into your vat or your container. So you'll dump it in there, and usually you'll add some more water. So the amount of water you add is going to depend on how thick you want your paper. So the more water you add, the thinner your paper is going to be. The less water, the higher your pulp content is going to be, and the thicker your paper is going to be. So up to you to decide. I've read you empty your blender of pulp, and then you kind of just fill up the container about a couple inches, an inch or two more, and that will be good. The next step is to use your mold and decal to create a sheet of paper. So you'll hear of the mold and decal in pretty much every paper making procedure you read. And so you can buy this online or at a store. They run about $10 or sometimes a little more. Or you can actually make this at home. Lots of tutorials out there on how to do this. The most basic one you can do is actually to take two picture frames of the same size that are not curved on the edges. They have to be flat. And on one of them, you'll take well, for both of them, you'll take out the glass and such so that you just have the wooden frame. And then on one of them, you'll staple a window screen to it. So if you just happen to have like old window screen lying around, or if you can get some from the store, you can actually just staple the window mesh over the one on the bottom, and that's your mold. The mold is the one with the mesh on it. And so what that serves as is this platform to collect the pulp and then allow the water to seep through. And then your decal is just the other frame. Some people will put like a foam kind of tape around the edges to create more of a sealed edge. Other people don't even do that. So I'm not a master in making paper, but from what I've seen, it's okay without the border having like a tape or something on it. And so what this does is you'll create like an inch or so a margin around the edges. And then on the inside, that will be your piece of paper created from the pulp. So your decal is like creating the shape of your paper, and the mold is actually providing the platform for the slurry to collect on and the water to seep through. And so the way that you actually use this once you have your slurry and your pulp all in your bucket is you mix it up, and then in one sweeping motion, you actually take your molded decal and you sweep it into the water, you scoop it down to the bottom, and then you lift up. And when you lift up, you want to do it as flat as you can. And once it's out of the water, what you'll do is you'll actually shake it front and back and side to side to even out the slurry material. And then you'll let it sit there for a minute or so, and you want the water to drain out of there. There's different things you can do at this step as well. You can take a sponge and start patting the underside of the mold. So you wouldn't be putting the sponge to the surface of the slurry. You would be putting it underneath to the surface of the wire mesh to help collect that water. Otherwise, you can just kind of shake it around a little bit and keep the water coming out of there. And once it's been a little bit dried, then you can move on to the next step. So what that kind of looks like in the mold and decal is here's your paper slurry inside of there, and then you'll take it out, and this top part, the decal, you'll take off afterwards. So this is your wet sheet of paper. And so this next step is called Kuching, which I just think is a really funny word. So what you do for this is you take the decal off of the mold, and then you're going to lay out a towel and then transfer that paper slurry onto that absorbent material. So in one motion, you'll put down the mold on its side, and then you'll flip it over so that the slurry is on top of the towel. And then what you can do is you can take your sponge and you can start drying off the back so that it's on the mesh, and that's going to help it stick to that towel. And you want to press it down because you want this to come off as one piece. So when you push it, make sure you're pushing kind of firmly, and then you can lift from the edge. You might have to help it off of the mesh a bit though. And so once you've transferred it over, you're going to start the pressing process. And so this step has a lot of different methods. It's all about the technique that you want to do, and you're just trying to get as much water out of that sheet of paper as you can. So one of the most common methods I've seen is that on that towel, you'll have your sheet of paper, and then you'll have like a little cup next to you, and your sponge. And you'll just continuously press down on the paper and wring out the sponge to collect as much water as you can. Another way you can go about this is actually to do like a layer of felt and then your sheet of paper and then another layer of felt. And then you can use like a rolling pin to kind of roll out the water, and then you'll take that felt and let that dry. And then another process is called the board pressing. And so that's where you create like a large stack. So maybe you use like 10 sheets of paper, you would layer felt and then paper, felt, paper, until you end up with felt again on the top. And then you would put a board on top of it and you would stand on top of it and try to press out as much water as you can doing it that way. These are just some of the different ways you can go about this. There's even more. I saw this other one where you roll it onto a piece of wood. So it's really up to you how kind of advanced you want to get with it and what kind of materials you have at home. So once you've pressed it, then you can start drying it. So again, there's a lot of different methods for this. One of them is that you can actually just lay it on a flat surface. If you want the pages to be more flat, they recommend that you use like a non-porous surface such as glass. So like putting them on window or plexiglass and then pressing it down firmly so that it sticks to that surface. And that's going to help it from like kind of crinkling up. The other way you can go about this is by stacking. So similar to how we were talking about drying or pressing it, you can also use a very similar method for drying. And so you'll put your paper and felt and you'll keep it stacked and put it under something kind of heavy to let it dry, and that pressure will help keep the pages flat. If you don't really care too much about how wavy the pages come out, you can actually just put them on the table and see what happens. Usually they end up pretty wavy if you don't kind of press them down onto a surface. If you're okay with that, then it really doesn't matter what you do with them. You can leave them hanging like on your shelf or something. You can also leave them to dry hanging up. So another thing is that you can press the paper onto felt, and then you can clip them up on a clothesline or something similar and leave them to hang dry. So the drying process does take a very long time. It takes a day or more for the pages to dry. If you're impatient, you can use a hair dryer or a heat gun to do so. And so there's a lot of different things you can do to kind of customize your paper. One of them is to add food coloring to the vat of pulp. So what you can do is you can add like blue food coloring to the vat at some point, and then your slurry will get dyed like a very light blue color, and so you can have blue paper or red paper, whatever food coloring you have available. Also, when the slurry is just coming out of the vat, you can start adding different kinds of materials. I've seen very common that people will put like pieces of plants, like flower petals in there to help decorate the paper. And then another thing you can do, instead of just using scrap papers, you can use newspaper for kind of like a vintage feel. And if you don't blend it fully, you can have this really like kind of chunks of newspaper, and you can use it to print pictures on and such to create your own custom art. And then another thing you can do that I read about is some people will use an iron to help flatten out the pages afterwards. And then you'll store them like in a book or under something heavy to keep them from bending. So again, this is something that you have total creative freedom over. It's a pretty easy process, a little bit time consuming, but overall it's a good way to recycle paper, and you can continuously recycle that paper. You can use it again, and then once you're done using it, you can soak it, blend it up, and just keep using the same materials over and over again, which is a pretty cool concept. And this is going to help reduce the amount of water that goes into the paper making process, even though you're using water for this. It's significantly less than if you continuously bought new paper every time you needed paper. So with that, that's the end of this tutorial. And I just wanted to throw out there that we're having an event next Saturday, or is it this coming Saturday at 11 a.m. And so this is a sustainable crafts workshop. I have microplastic sifters to give away and a demonstration to show everybody. And the Plastic Wave Project is going to be there to teach us how to make reusable bags out of old t-shirts. So if that's something you're interested in doing, you can go ahead and register at the Sussex County Library website under the events tab.